Thank you very much, and it really is an honour to be asked along this evening to talk to you guys and girls, and thank you for coming out on what is such a cold night outside. So I really do appreciate it, and it's nice to see so many faces. So my name is Liz Mcconaghy. I had an extensive career in the Air Force on Chinooks. Sorry, I'll close it down. Oh, there you go. Are you okay? Yeah. I spent over 17.5 years flying on Chinook helicopters just down the road at RAF Odium. And then I left in 2019 and transitioned in the civilian world, more of which I'll come on to later. So I guess let's go to the beginning. Where did it all start? So first of all, this is me aged about 3.5, maybe 4. And I announced to my mum when I was that age that I wanted to be a stripper. And all joking aside, I used to tell my mum all the time that I wanted the kind of job where if you're on a game show and they've got the plinth in front and it has what your job title is, I didn't want something that everyone knew what it was. So I didn't want to be a teacher or lawyer or a banker. I wanted something that whenever I told people what I did, they had to go and look it up or Google it. So yeah, that was essentially what kind of drove me on through life, to kind of find this unique job where nobody knew what it was. Thankfully, I didn't grow up and become a stripper. A lot of people know what that is. I had a big brother, and my older brother was really into the army. So at a young age, he used to play sort of running around in army clubber. And this is one Christmas where he got head to toe army gear from Santa Claus, and I got one little green hat to play with him. And I kept swapping it onto his chair the morning that Santa had arrived, and Mum kept putting it back on my chair, and I kept swapping it back to his chair. I didn't want anything to do with green or the army or anything like that. I was more the Barbie girl, as you can see from the picture. But eventually I submitted and I put on the green hat, and my brother and I had a great young childhood playing, army out and about in the countryside. It was fantastic. But then I joined high school and suddenly boys were more important, and I started to play hockey. And I never joined the Air Cadets at school, despite the fact that I followed into a career in the Air Force. I never joined the Air Cadets or was in any way involved in the forces thereafter, really. Until the day that my brother went up to join the army. So he went up to a place called Palace Barracks in Northern Ireland, which some of you may have heard of or be familiar with, to do his BARB test, which is the entry test to get into the army. And I went with him. So I was sat in the careers office while he went in to do his exam. And on the table in front of me, there was a magazine with a man hanging out the side of a helicopter on what I thought was a piece of rope. And I said to the guy in uniform, I said, "What's this job, this guy hanging out the side with his rope?" And he said, "Well, first of all, it's not a piece of rope, it's a wire. And the job title is helicopter crewman or loadmaster." And that was it. I'd found the thing. I'd found that job that I wanted to do that nobody knew what it was. And I was hooked. I was sold. I didn't really know much about it at that point, but that's exactly why I wanted to do it. So I did a few more inquiries, had a few more interviews at Palace Barracks, and then got accepted to go across to RAF Cranwell to do my aptitude testing there. I actually got the aptitude for navigator, but my arms were 2 centimetres too short, which was irrelevant really, because even if I had got the aptitude to be the first ever direct entrant Red Arrow, I would have turned it down to be a crewman, because that's what I thought was the coolest job ever. So I went over to Cranwell and joined on my 19th birthday. And was very, very lucky that 3 months later, after running around most of England with a pine pole strapped to my shoulder and an amazing course of crewmates, I managed to pass out as a sergeant at the end of 2001. So I was only 19 years old, really wet behind the ears, really naive. I had only ever been to England for my aptitude test before, so I didn't really know much about England or the UK. I thought Leeds was near London, because obviously all the big cities are near each other, aren't they? I'd never had a curry before. That's changed now. But yeah, I was very young and naive. And I have to say that from the very second I put that uniform on the day I tested, I was amongst a really amazing group of people. And that is a theme that's gone the whole way through my career, of this team ethos that you get in the forces, where everybody wants you to succeed and you become part of a big family. And that family of crewmates got me through that basic training course. There's absolutely no two ways about it. But there was only 3 females on the course. We had, I think, about 30 or 40 in total on the course, and just 3 females. So it became infinitely obvious at that point that I was going to be in the minority, and that went on for the rest of my career. So I spent another couple of months at Cranwell doing some very basic loadmaster training, and that was learning things about like the air law, a little bit about radios, that kind of thing, and very basic loading of how an aircraft works. So a bit of like centre of gravity and CFG calculations, nothing too taxing at this point. And next we went on to RAF Shawbury. So before you get to RAF Shawbury, we were given a dream sheet where you could pick if you wanted to go fixed wing aircraft or rotary. And I, again, at this point, had decided that rotary was my thing. So a few people in the course picked fixed wing, and at the time, the RAF operated the old TriStar aircraft, which some of you might be familiar with. And a few of my mates wanted to go TriStars. And I said, why do you want to go on TriStars? And they said, well, because we get to travel the world and stay in hotels. And I thought, that sounds rubbish. I'd much rather go to war and get shot at and live in a tent for the rest of my life, which is what I ended up doing. But anyway, so I put helicopters on my dream sheet, and off I went to RAF Shawbury. So I spent 9 months at RAF Shawbury. I was really lucky back in the day in that I think now that a lot of the flying system, you have to spend a lot of time holding. I was very lucky, and I went straight through Cromwell, straight up to Shawbury. So I arrived at Shawbury, and I was still only 20 at this point, so still really, really young. And that's where we started our helicopter training. So all the stuff we learnt at Cromwell was now put into force in the air. And we used to have a joke on our course that the second the rotor blade started turning, it sucked your brain out. Because no matter what you practiced on the ground, as soon as that thing started moving, you forgot everything. And the second you pressed the radio button to transmit a radio call, you just had no idea what you're going to say, no matter how many times you practiced it. So again, I had a great time at Shawbury. And things ramp up really slowly. You start with some really, really basic helicopter skills, and then you go on to learn about how to land in confined areas. You learn about how to put things on the hook underneath the aircraft, so undersling things around. And essentially what a crewman's job is the eyes and ears of the pilot. So anywhere you go in the helicopter, you now become the eyes and ears for him. So you can tell him how high he's going to be or how close he's coming to the ground. If you're landing on a slope, you can talk the skids of the aircraft down. And the big skill that we have to learn at Shawbury is crew resource management. So now there's 4 of us in this little helicopter, and the pilots up until that point had all been flying as solo pilots and not really used to asking the other people to do stuff for them. And it sounds really silly, but actually if you're so used to doing everything your own, you try to land the helicopter yourself, you try to navigate yourself, do all the radios yourself, almost to prove that you can do it. And half the battle was trying to get them to hand some stuff over to us as the crewmen. However, I was the only one in my course at this point, the only female. So I'd gone from having 3 girls in basic training to now just being the only girl on my course at Shawbury. So again, it's becoming more and more obvious that I'm going to be in the minority for the rest of my career. But after Shawbury, you get given another dream sheet, and we got to put which helicopter we wanted to go on. And the Chinook had stolen my heart many, many years before. That first day I went up to Palace Barracks on my own for my interview without my brother. This is when I'd already decided I want to be a crewman. I parked my little Corsa in the lay-by and went in to get my car pass. And a Chinook came right over the top of me at about 20 feet into land. And all I could see was the belly of the aircraft and the thump of the noise. Most of you in the room have probably heard a Chinook or seen a Chinook, and it does get you right there. And it did that day. And I remember thinking, God, that's just amazing. That's what I want to fly on. And it was only years later when I actually did the job for quite some time, I realised that Chinooks hardly ever went into Palace Barracks. That was very unique that day that a Chinook had gone in there because the landing site is so small. So I still look back now and think it was fate that day that I saw a Chinook, but I was sold. So when we got to the end of Shawbury, I put on my dream sheet, Chinook, Chinook, Chinook as options 1, 2 and 3, and promptly got posted to Merlin's. And I was gutted. So we have a thing called a role demo at the end of the course where you get told where you're going. And it usually involves some beer and a mini assault course and some stupid games. And I finished my pint. I think I've had 3 pints in my entire life, 3 pints of beer. I don't drink beer. And they've all been involved in these kind of days. And I drank my pint of beer, and at the bottom of the glass, it said Merlin's. And I was gutted. Straight away, the course instructor came over and said, actually, you and another chap in the course are going Chinook because the Merlins are so far behind in their course, they can't take you. And the Chinooks are crying out for people on the front line. Oh my God, saved literally by the skin of my teeth. So off I went to Odium, which is just down the road. And this was a very young Liz, still 20. I had my 21st birthday when I was on the OCU, which is the Operational Conversion Unit to Chinooks, which is essentially like the Chinook school. And what we learned on that really is everything that we learned at Shawbury, but ramping up again. So the Chinook is a huge aircraft. I mean, it's 100 feet from tip to tip. And inside the cabin, you can fit 2 Landovers, a 105 gun, a Land Rover and a trailer. You kind of get the idea. We can fit 40 troops, but we can surge to 60 troops if we need to. So the cabin is huge. And we have to learn now how to put even more stuff inside that, because the Griffin helicopter we flew at Shawbury isn't even a patch. In fact, it would probably fit inside a Chinook. And the Chinook has 3 hooks underneath as well. So unlike the little, again, Griffin, which only had one tiny hook, and you could pretty much lift a box of packed lunches underneath, the Chinook you could lift up to 24.5 tons and up to 10.5 tons underneath. So it's a beast of an aircraft. So I spent the OCU basically for 6 months learning how to operate that aircraft, and then got posted in my first squadron. So my first squadron was 27 Squadron, and ODM operates 3 squadrons. It's got 27 Squadron, 18 Squadron, and 7 Squadron, which is the Special Forces Squadron. 18 and 27 were the main options for me, because at the time females weren't really accepted on SF. It was never written in black and white, but it was kind of the unwritten rule. And all the instructors were in 18 Squadron. That's what the OCU was. So I was like, I want to get away from the instructors, like we all do. So I asked for a posting to 27. So off I went to 27 Squadron, 21 years old, and within a couple of months ramped up to go off to Iraq. So yeah, I was the youngest aircrew ever to go to Iraq. I was still an aircrew cadet technically, because I hadn't got my combat ready ticket at this point. So my Iraq medal says aircrew cadet around the side of it. And there's only 2 other people, well, there's only one other person in the world has that, and that's one of my mates, Logie. But everyone else had sergeant on theirs or above. So it's pretty unique in that respect. But by the time I got to Iraq, the war fighting had finished. So the squadron had already been there for a couple of months. And the way that the squadrons work is that they would go for 2 or 3 months at a time and then swap out with the opposite squadron. So my squadron had already been there, mostly during the invasion and the war fighting days. And now it was just the routine tasking, kind of keeping the country running. And I couldn't wait to get out the door. You know, I remember seeing the guys come back in their combats after they'd been back through Brize Norton and come back to the squadron, and they'd be all dusty and they'd be full of all their war stories and talking about stuff in Iraq. And I just could not wait to get out and get involved. So I was really chuffed when eventually my turn to go came round, and I say I was still limited combat ready. And the first thing that hit me was the heat. I mean, being a Northern Irish girl, I'm not really used to heat, let's be honest, but it was roasting. It was 45 degrees the first day we landed. And one of the first things we have to go is go to the range and zero our weapons. And that particular day, one of our engineers came down with heat stroke and nearly died right beside me, and had to get medevaced by one of our aircraft off to Shiber, which was the hospital there. So a bit of a wake up call really, and suddenly realised that we're not in Kansas anymore. This is kind of big juju. And some of the things we were doing, like I say, was routine tasking, and that's just moving a lot of the troops and rations and things around the area. But we also did a thing called Eagle VCPs. That was quite a big task that we had in Iraq. This is just a picture of one of the roads out there, so you can see kind of the infrastructure and how damaged it was getting. But Eagle VCPs are essentially where we'd fill the aircraft up with troops, whatever infantry unit were in theatre at the time. And most of the time I was there, it was the RAF regiment. And it was a thing that had been practiced in Northern Ireland a lot. So we'd drop them off on the road somewhere, just like this. They would run out the back of the aircraft, and we'd leave them there for about 30 minutes while they stopped vehicles and searched for weapons, or generally hunting for baddies, as I like to summarise it. And we'd go off and just burn holes in the sky for 30 minutes and have great fun. And I still remember my time in Iraq very fondly, because that's where I really learnt to operate the aircraft. I'm sure a lot of you have seen or maybe heard of the Chinook display, and a lot of the manoeuvres that the Chinook display do, such as the Gorney, which is the corkscrew, and a lot of the quick stops and manoeuvres like that, we just practiced those for half an hour so that the junior pilots could learn how to handle the aircraft. So it was absolutely brilliant fun. And then we go and pick the troops back up and take them back to Basra. And Basra is where we had the majority of our time whenever we were in Iraq. So we were really lucky. It had a Pizza Hut. So for me, I was like, well, this isn't really war yet. This is pretty benign. We also had a bar there called the Camel's Toe, and it had a tank in it and a few other bits and bobs off the battlefield. And we were allowed 3 tins of beer at night time. So again, you'd have a long day tasking, and then we'd head back to the bar for a beer and maybe stop off at Pizza Hut on the way. So again, that's most of my old crewmates from 27 Squadron. And it didn't really feel like war at this point. We did hold a duty called Immediate Response Team, so IRT, which was essentially the flying ambulance. And that was held from a place called Al Amara, which was halfway up the country between Basra and Baghdad. But it was very quiet. Most of the stuff we would pick up, most of the casualties would be vehicle injuries or just people with appendix problems, and those like normal injuries, nothing too kinetic. So at that point, nothing felt really too bad for me being at war. And the accommodation wasn't bad either. So top left on that picture, that's the tent city that we had in Basra. And it's a pretty good setup, really. Obviously, the fire inspectors have been around at some point before this picture, because you can see the fire extinguishers are all where they're supposed to be, which wasn't always the case. But I lived in one of these tents with the lads that I flew with. And that I had one deployment there where I was sanctioned off by the army to go and stay in the female tent. And it was the most miserable 2 weeks of my life. And finally, our boss went, so she's coming back with us, because I was holding standby with the guys. I was crewing in and out with the guys, and we'd be up all hours of the day to go flying. So it made so much more sense that I was back with my crew. And thankfully, I did get to go back with them. And inside one of those tents up on the left-hand side, inside those would be 4 other smaller rooms. And in the small room, you'd have about 8 beds, little cot beds, and we'd have a little netted pod that went around there. And in there, you'd have your little hanging drawer set. You put your Bergen under your bed, and as soon as you got there and you unpacked, you felt like home. And we'd all take our own duvets and pillowcases out, and you really could make it home for the next 2.5 months. So it wasn't really too bad. And then in 2005, the Chinook force pulled out of Iraq and turned their eyes towards Afghanistan. So bottom right-hand side is the accommodation that we stayed in Afghanistan. That's our tent. I recall back to the story earlier where I said my friend went 5 stars and wanted to stay in hotels for his career. This is what I stayed in for most of mine. But again, you could make it home. So inside these tents, and it really is just a 12 by 12, it's almost a step back from what we had in Iraq. That's what it looked like inside. We're not known for our tidiness, us air crew. But yeah, that's our little tent. You can see my bed space was bottom right. You can just see the little pink towel popping out. And I would always get a corner bed space. Thankfully, the lads would always let me have the corner bed so that I could hang a flag around and put a towel at one end. So I had a little tiny area to get changed in. And ladies, it was almost like changing at the beach every day. You'd be like wriggling in and out of things. But they were very, very kind, and they always averted their eyes if they needed to. And actually, we had a great time. It was like living with 60 big brothers, you know, on debt, and they all looked after me, and they all really were there for me every turn. And eventually, towards the end of Afghanistan, we moved into some hardened accommodation, which was essentially like big ISO containers, and it was considered a huge upgrade. It was like, oh my goodness, we're in like hotels now. That's what it felt like. And that's the accommodation you can see in the right-hand picture there. So again, actually really basic. You know, it's definitely not the Ritz by any stretch of the imagination. And you can see my Chinook display hand just popping up the top of my bed space there. But yeah, it was a really simple life, and it wasn't glamorous by any stretch of the imagination. But you know, it was better than what a lot of the other guys out there had who were up in the Helmand Valley. So whenever the Chinook force did arrive in Afghanistan, again, that was 2005. And we were mainly based out of Kandahar Air Base, which is a huge air base, mostly run by the Americans. And again, it had a Pizza Hut, it had various coffee shops, it had a Burger King. Didn't really feel like war again. It was pretty benign. And in the early days in Afghanistan, it was really quiet. We had a very small footprint of British troops on the ground, and Bastion didn't even exist. So we as the Chinook force spent most of our days doing routine tasking and moving a lot of the infrastructure that built Camp Bastion from Kandahar Air Base all the way across the Red Desert. So in this side, you can just see at the bottom there, the red sand, and that's the Red Desert. And the Red Desert looked like icing on a cake. It was the darkest red colour that was so different to the rest of the sand around it. And it just started and stopped instantly. It didn't peter out at any point. It was like someone had poured icing on the ground. And it was about a 45-minute flight across the Red Desert to get to where Camp Bastion was being built. And we took everything you could ever think to want to build a camp. So we would put the ramp down in the morning on a tasking day, and we'd have cable drums, we'd have oil, we'd have step ladders, a cement mixer, the odd donkey, you name it, it came in the back of our aircraft. So the early days in Afghanistan was very much just moving all that kit across to Camp Bastion. And Camp Bastion's off to the west and at the very southern edge of the Helmand Valley. And we had some troops at Camp Bastion. We had some troops at a place called Lashkar, which is about 10 minutes flying southeast of Bastion. A little tiny footprint of soldiers in Sangin, and some right at the top of the Helmand Valley in Mcconaghy. So this is the Helmand Valley, and again, this is where we'd fly up and down every day, just moving some of those troops around. And I have to say, I've been to a lot of places around the world, but Afghanistan is the most breathtaking place you will ever see. The mountain ridge that goes up and down the valley is just simply quite beautiful. Yeah, I think it's because it remains so untouched you know, in terms of tourism. That's maybe why it's maintained its beauty throughout the years. Gets cold in winter though, I must admit. And at the very top of the Helmand Valley, this is Mcconaghy. So we had a very small footprint of British soldiers up at Mcconaghy as well at the very beginning. And that's what the water looked like. It was just absolutely ice pure blue. And on a hot tasking day when it's 45, 50 degrees in the back of an aircraft and you're hot, dusty and sweaty, honestly, the temptation just to dive out the back of the ramp into that was too much. And we actually once had to go and pick a soldier up who had jumped off the water tower at Mcconaghy and injured himself quite badly. But that story's in the book, so you'll have to buy the book to find out exactly what happened to him. He did survive though. But you can see the minigun just popping out there at the bottom as well. So that's the one of the guns that we use to defend the aircraft, but I'll come on to more of that later. But I became a bit of a dust connoisseur over the years. So this is the one thing you'll find when you're flying around in lots of deserts, that you get used to dust and the different formats that you have in dust. So the dust that we had in Iraq was very hard dust, almost like the sand you would get at the beach. It was quite heavy, quite granular. And this sounds like a really boring fact, but it meant that it didn't actually pick up off the ground that much when we flew over it. It was so heavy, it would stay put. The dust in Afghanistan was like talcum powder. So the second we went near the ground, that stuff kicked up with spectacular fashion, as you can see from the picture. And now here's the skill. We as a crew have to get that aircraft on the ground before the dust engulfs the aircraft and the pilot can't see anything. So coming back to the crewman being the eyes and ears of the captain, he'll be flying the aircraft and we'll set up for an approach to come into land. And at 40 feet, he'll start descending the aircraft and we'll start looking out to 6 o'clock and watching this dust pick up. And the skill is that we can then patter that dust as it comes along the side of the aircraft, and he's listening to where it is along the aircraft. And if it gets to 10 feet and he hasn't got below 10 feet when it's at the cockpit, he has to overshoot because he's going to just essentially dust out. And there we go. So you can see the picture on the left, that's essentially what we as the crewman will be looking at. You can see the dust just starting to pick up there, and we'll patter along the side of the aircraft. So we'll say dust cloud building, ramp, center, door with you. And the pilot will be listening very, very carefully to that patter before he lands on. Now, in theory, if anyone in the aircraft calls overshoot, the pilot should go round, because you might have seen something that he hasn't seen underneath the aircraft, such as troops, a huge crater, a boulder, who knows, but or enemy. So if the pilot hears overshoot, he should go round. There has been occasion where pilots have elected to continue and land. Now, the most of the time that that's happened with me, and I haven't wanted to punch the pilot in the head afterwards, has mostly been on merch outs, which again is this flying ambulance, where we've had to go in and get a casualty who's on death's door, and we've had to go in, and that's when the pilots earn their money. And that is probably the only time I've ever forgiven a pilot for continuing to land whenever I've called overshoot. But they've got me on the ground every time, and they're a skillful bunch. Thankfully, none of them are in the room to hear me say that, though. Don't say it very often. But yeah, so again, that's the main thing we had to do in Afghanistan, where things had ramped up from Iraq, was the dust. So what was our main job in Afghanistan? Well, I've already said at the start, it was routine tasking, moving stuff around to help build Camp Bastion. But we did a lot of routine tasking, again, moving troops. So I said earlier, you can fit 40 troops in a Chinook, and you can fit up to 60 if you're surging. Well, I didn't even want to count how many are in these pictures, because sometimes you just had to get the job done. So pictures on the left, you can see the guys are all smiling. I suspect those are a lot of the guys that are coming back from R&R, which is one of the main jobs we did. We used to pick the guys up in the forward operating bases and get them back to Camp Bastion to get their flights home for a couple of weeks back with their loved ones. And they were always happy troops. Not so happy 2 weeks later when we took them back out again. And on the right hand side, that's probably some troops that we've, I suspect from the kit in that picture, that some troops that we've picked up after deliberate op. So they've been fighting a war in the up the Helmand Valley for 2 or 3 weeks, and we eventually collected them, and they're all back in one piece. So, you know, picking up troops like that and seeing those smiles down the back of the aircraft always made the job worthwhile. And we were the postmen of Helmand. So this picture was taken one Christmas, where essentially we had to put strops across the windows so we wouldn't lose any of the mail bags, and we put the ramp down. The 4-tonner truck would pull up in the 6 o'clock, and we were just like, fill her up, and off we go like Santa's sledge around Helmand. And truth is, for most of my career, My mum thought that this is all I did in Helmand, because there was no way I was going to tell her the truth about what was actually happening. So I said that I was on the Chinook that delivered the post. And that was all I did, Mum. I'm quite safe. You don't need to worry about me. So, but again, every time we put the ramp down when we arrived at one of the FOBs, we were making a difference. And whether or not I was delivering troops in and out, whether or not I was taking fresh rations or ammunition, or whether or not I was just taking a letter from home, we made a difference to that person on the other side of that ramp. And that's what my entire career really felt like, that we actually made a difference. Like I mentioned earlier, inside a Chinook, you can fit some Land Rovers. So that's me hand signaling to the driver to get a Land Rover on board. And again, it's quite a skill, really, because the guy driving the Land Rover is obviously trying not to steer into the side of the aircraft, which I don't want him to do. And he's also trying to watch me. And no one can hear a thing because you've got the rotors turning, and a Chinook is really, really loud. So yeah, that's just a little example of some things that we can fit inside. And we always put stuff underneath. So that's the Lynx helicopter that went down in the Red Desert that we had to undersling back to Camp Bastion. We also underslung an Apache that went down at FOB Edinburgh, halfway up the Helmand Valley. We had to take it back to Bastion. And that's just a 105 gun at the bottom there that we're delivering to some of the troops out in the area. But because we were top of the food chain, we were always top of the banter chain as well. So all the other helicopter operators, had to bow down whenever we had to go and rescue them and undersling them back to somewhere. We're like, okay, we'll go and help you out. So, and my brother, as it happens, whenever he joined the army, went on to become a REME engineer. So he worked on a Lynx helicopter for his career and fixed them. So there was a lot of family banter about the top left picture when we had to go and rescue one of them. But I mentioned earlier about the dust landings whenever we're trying to get the aircraft on the deck before the dust cloud catches us up. You add another element to that when you've now got a 105 gun sitting underneath your aircraft. And the trick is to try and put that thing down and release it from the aircraft nice and safely so you don't trash the piece of equipment, but before the dust cloud gets you again. So again, that's where the skill, that's what we practice here in the UK a lot, and that's where we go again abroad and do a lot of our exercises around the world to go and find dust and to practice those skills in places where we're not going to get shot at. So as well as routine tasking and delivering mail, we did a lot of things called deliberate ops. So deliberate operations are where we essentially would go and find Taliban strongholds, and we would take the troops in to assault them and to either bring back some detainees, look for weapons, and generally just sort of try and take some land and take some compounds. So this is a particularly interesting one, which was when we went in as the whole British forces formed up with the Americans to go and take Mcconaghy. So Mcconaghy was a point halfway up the Helmand Valley that was a really key point for the British forces to take. We had Mcconaghy at the very start of the campaign and handed it back to the Afghans and to the Taliban, actually. And essentially the British commanders decided a couple of years later that we had to take Mcconaghy back to try and get back control of the Helmand Valley. So Ops Certain Death was spun up. Now, it wasn't actually called that, but we as crews started to nickname it Ops Certain Death, which our squadron boss kept trying to tell us to stop calling it that, but the name caught on. So as did many operations after that, we used to routinely nickname Ops Certain Death. But this was Mcconaghy, and the days running up to this, we had so many briefings with the Americans. We were in hangars briefing, we were doing rock drills, we were practice walking around what we were going to do in the air. And there was a whole fleet of American aircraft. We had, I think, 5 British Chinooks. We had maybe 16 Dutch Apaches with us. It was a whole air package that was going into Mcconaghy that day to assault Mcconaghy. And things were really starting to ramp up. It started to get a bit like, oh, this is slightly different to everything else I've ever done. And when we came out of our last big briefing, the boss asked us to all stand together and get this picture. And I remember thinking, we've never had a picture before any of these operations. And I had this vision of being next to like the picture of the Fury or something in some Air Force museum in years to come. But thankfully, it went off without too much drama, hence why I'm here telling the story. But we got to the aircraft, and the American Padres, who's essentially the American Reverends, had blessed all of the aircraft with holy oil, which we noticed on our walk around. So as if we weren't tense enough, we we now had a cross on all of the aircraft, and our aircraft in particular had the Padre, the British Padre on board. So I thought, well, we're definitely going to be safe. But the problem with having a Padre on board is that the second you start talking to him, you can't help yourself but swear. It's almost like the opposite of what you want to do. But he kept us safe that day. He really did. And Mcconaghy went off without too much of a hitch. But everything we do by day, we mostly learn to do by night. So this is a little picture of what you would see through our MVG goggles, which are our night vision goggles. So those essentially clip to the front of your helmet. We put a counterbalance weight on the back of our helmet, and that means that the helmet's not going to slide forward on your head. So you effectively triple the weight of your head when you're wearing these things. And then as a crewman, you're now hanging out the back of the aircraft and rotating your head on a fulcrum. So hence why I've got a bit of a bad neck these days. But this is what the view looks like. So that's just me looking at another aircraft across the dispersal. And the way vision goggles work is that they have to have a little bit of cultural lighting. So they have to have some lighting coming into the tubes for the tubes to actually work, which here in the UK is never really a problem, because even on the darkest night when there's no moon, there's a thing called cultural lighting, which is essentially all the towns and villages around the world, the UK, light up the sky. You don't really get that in Afghanistan so much. So we have to really play by the rules of the moon. And there's a thing called red alone, which lasts for 2 or 3 nights of the month where there's no moon. And if we get tasked to go flying in red alone, it will only be for a Cat Alpha or T1 casualty on Mars. You would never deliberately plan an operation in any kind of red alone conditions, because it is probably the most challenging conditions you will ever fly in. The picture definitely doesn't look like that. So I mentioned earlier about guns. There's a reason why we had guns fitted in Afghanistan to our aircraft, and that's because some other people on the ground had guns as well. So this is my bullet hole. I have been shot at many times over my career in Afghanistan, but this is one of the closest near misses I've had. And again, it was on a very benign day, a normal routine tasking day. And over the years, a lot of people have said, oh, you're so brave. The problem with getting shot at is 9 times out of 10 it's happened before you've even realised it's happened. It's like crossing the road and nearly getting hit by a car. It's over before you know it. And it's actually really hard to pick up that you're getting shot at in a loud Chinook, because you can't always hear the bullets unless they're really and then you can hear this tink 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 around the aircraft as they come in around you. And that's what happened this particular day, this tink tink tink. And I thought, well, I know they're pretty close, but there's not a lot you can do apart from man your weapon. You know, you've got a weapon fitted for a reason. It's not a water pistol, as I used to routinely say, and it's there to defend the aircraft and the troops and crew on board. So yeah, so that particular day, a round came in just above my head. It rotated and rumbled through the aircraft and got embedded on the other side of the aircraft. And when we landed on back at Camp Bastion and shut down for battle damage assessment, the engineers very kindly dug it out for me and gave it to me. So it's in my bedside drawer. I also had another incident on one of the deliberate ops I was talking about earlier, where we had to overshoot and go round for a second go at the target, which is always asking for trouble. We woke the Taliban up, and now they knew we were coming. And we did. We took some AAA, which is high caliber machine gun fire, and it landed under my feet. So we had ballistic panels fitted along the floor of the aircraft for this very reason, actually. And the panel that I was stood on caught the bullet. So and the panel creased up like that right underneath my feet. So very lucky girl. And again, the engineers very kindly dug that one out for me as well. And they always say there's a bullet out there with everyone's name on it. Well, I've got both of mine. So yeah. But ironically, being shot at wasn't the nearest I came to dying in Afghanistan. So this is very early on in my career. I think it's maybe my 2nd or 3rd tour out there. And Mcconaghy Dam, I showed you earlier, was that beautiful, water. That was to the north of Bastion by about 45 minutes flying. So it was quite isolated. And this particular day, myself and my crew were taking an underslung load up to Mcconaghy with another aircraft with us. We used to fly everywhere in Afghanistan as a pair, or if we didn't have another Chinook, we'd take an Apache with us. And we dropped off the underslung load and went to depart the landing site and flew into a huge set of 250-foot wires. So the wires that you would see around the UK, the huge pylons, just another set of those. And here in the UK, we are we always refer to wires as helicopter killers. And if it's a smaller helicopter, a set of wires in the UK will absolutely take an aircraft out of the sky, and it probably won't be a good outcome for the crew. Chinook's pretty robust, however, it can still absolutely kill you. So in the UK, we do lots of recce's. We have all the maps and all the moving maps now updated all the time with all the new wires that are strung around the UK. And we're always looking out for them. Afghanistan, you don't have that luxury. And a lot of the wires were just not marked. Now, we had routinely been up and around Mcconaghy, but it turns out the British troops had put up these wires and hadn't actually informed the rest of the theatre. So as we dropped the underswing load off, we transited out of the landing area and flew straight into them. So the first thing I heard was a loud bang, and then looked out into the 3 o'clock because I was at the door at the front at the time, and the wires were sparking off into the 3 o'clock. And the smell of burning electricity filled the aircraft, filled my nostrils. I still remember it to this day. It was so pungent. I looked around to 6 o'clock, and my crewmate Logie, who I mentioned earlier, he was now halfway through the centre hatch. And it was only because the aircraft had jerked so badly, it had thrown him through the hatch. It was only his harness that had saved him, and he managed to get back in through the hatch. The aircraft was now wallowing towards the ground, and I thought we'd ripped the aft pylon off. That's how the aircraft was handling. So I started to grab my harness. We wear a monkey harness in the back of the aircraft is what we call it. And it's essentially a big harness, a big belt that goes around your waist with 2 little pulls on it so you can grab it and release them if you need to quickly. And I thought we were going in. So we wallowed towards the ground, and at about 20, and the pilot was just shouting, I can't see, I can't see. And obviously the cockpit had come in over him. And 20 feet above the ground, the co-pilot, a guy called Marty Locke, pulled in power and said, I have control. And we pulled up from the ground. And it's probably the closest I've ever come to death, and but ironically not by enemy fire. So a massive lesson to be taken away there. You know, it's not always the enemy that are going to get you. It can be anything. So that's why being air crew, you just got to be eyes and ears on stalks all the time. But we limped back to Bastion. We had our other crewmate, our other playmate aircraft with us, and they flew along beside us. And if this had happened in the UK, the first thing we would have done was land on and inspect the damage. But you don't have that luxury in Afghanistan of landing on a battlefield with Taliban everywhere. So we very slowly limped our way back to Bastion. The other aircraft flew beside us and did a battle assessment and checked what was missing or hanging off the aircraft as we flew back. And I positioned my go bag, which is a bag we all carry with us, which is essentially full of water and ammunition in case you have to go on the run. And it's always somewhere pretty close in the aircraft, and like across the cabin or somewhere under a seat. But mine was right beside me that day. I pulled it out and had it within arm's reach the whole way back. But we got back to Bastion, thankfully, shut down, and the squadron boss came out to meet us and check we were all okay, and that was great. And the aircraft got parked up in the hangar that night. My brother was there at the time. He was in Afghanistan, the same deployment, but with the Army Air Corps. And he came over the next day and he said, have you seen that aircraft in the hangar, Liz? And I went, yeah. He says, oh, they were lucky, that crew, weren't they? Do you know who it was? And I was like, don't tell Mum. Just don't tell Mum. So yeah, pretty lucky girl that day. Okay, so I want to sort of finish the Afghan bit with what was my biggest honour and absolute privilege whenever I was flying on the whole of the Chinook time and really in Afghanistan. And that was MERT. So MERT was, I spoke earlier about immediate response team in Iraq. MERT was the same thing, it just had a different name when we got to Afghanistan, and that was Medical Emergency Response Team. So the flying ambulance, so what you would have seen in the news, Chinook goes out to rescue the casualties off the battlefield. And this is what the MERT aircraft looked like. So to the untrained eye, I know you're looking at that and going, oh my God, there's stuff everywhere. And there was, but we knew where every single bit of kit was in that aircraft, as did the medics. They knew where the oxygen was, the cannulas, the sharp spots, and that was so they could place their hand on anything in the middle of the night whilst the aircraft was manoeuvring. If the aircraft was full of casualties, they knew where to find their kit. Every time we did an aircraft swap, we would take everything in that picture and put it on the next aircraft in exactly the same spot. Towards the ramp, you can see the aircrew kits. That's my kit at the back there. And again, we would have absolutely everything set up. And we would also carry, so the way the MERT crewing went, we would have a crew of 4 for the Chinook. We would have 4 to 6 medics. So an anaesthetist, a doctor, a combat medic, kind of make up of those. And then we would have some force protection chaps as well, who were whatever infantry soldiers were in theatre at the time. And they would sit the seats towards the rear there. So Yeah, it was whenever the bat phone went, it was like organised chaos, and we'd all sprint out to the aircraft and get your kit on as quick as you could. But everything was prepped, your latches were undone, all your Velcro was done, all the switches in the aircraft were all readied, and we'd do a walk around in the morning to check that everything was good to go. The reason why there's a rubberized floor, so early days in Afghanistan, it was really quiet. And then as soon as we started to push more and more troops up the Helmand Valley from about 06, 07 onwards, things got pretty kinetic pretty quickly. And we would routinely come back from merch shouts, and the whole aircraft floor was just awash with blood. And our engineers would have to clean the bottom of the aircraft out and wash the floor and essentially brush the blood out through the floor. And it would always end up dripping through the ramp hinge, which you can just see at the near edge of this picture. So it was pretty gruesome stuff. It was almost like MASH. And eventually they decided to put the rubberized floor on to try and protect the aircraft, and just to make it a little bit more palatable for everyone to have to clean up. So how did a merc work? How did a merc shout work? So, like I say, we have a crew of 4. In the early days, we used to hold the duty for a week. And then after it started to become very kinetic, the chain of command decided to reduce the duty to 24 hours on and 24 hours off, because it was becoming so messy. So we would hold merch in the tent, just similar to the one I showed you earlier, that nice, lovely, the Ritz Hotel. And the medics would be in the next tent along, and then we'd have the force protection in the 3rd tent along, and the engineers in a tent nearby holding the line, as we would call it. So we'd be sat there on response time 15 minutes during the day and 30 minutes at night time, so we were allowed to go to sleep. But that was a limit, never a target. So as soon as we got a 9-liner through, we would sprint out to the aircraft. We never went, oh, we've got another 10 minutes. Yeah, let's just hang around here. We went, and we went as quick as we could. So essentially, troops are up in the Helmand Valley and someone gets injured. So that could be anything from a vehicle incident to troops in contact, so gunfire, to an IED. And all the troops up in the Helmand Valley would carry what was a 9-liner medevac form, like you can see on the screen. When one of those guys got injured, they would call through to Battle HQ at Camp Bastion and fill in the details on this medevac. Now, the reason why that's so important is because everybody used the same form the whole way across the theatre. And that became really important whenever we were getting the details through, because inevitably the radios became really busy and you didn't always get the information in the confusion of battle exactly as you were meant to. So knowing what was coming next meant even if someone stepped on the radio transmission, you could generally fill in the gaps or kind of know exactly what that message meant. So everybody stuck to the same format. So troops get injured, one of the guys will call into Camp Bastion with the 9-liner, and Camp Bastion HQ will call our tent straight away. So the phone will go in the corner of the tent, we'll pick it up, take down the details, and 9 times out of 10, we'd only have maybe the top 3 lines. And we'd sprint out to the aircraft with those details and then get the rest of the details on the way to the casualty. So yeah, call sign location was key, because we had to know where we were going and who we were talking to. You can see the priority of injuries there, 1, 2, and 3. So we essentially categorized these whenever we were working with the American troops to T1, T2, and T3. And T1 injury was someone who was on death's door, so they had an hour to live. So we would go, and again, coming back to the red alum I spoke about earlier, we would go in red alum to pick up someone who was a T1 casualty. T2 was slightly better way, still not great, but yeah, we've got to go and get them. And T3 was walking wounded. So we would get a mix of anything from T1, 1 T1, 2 T1s and a T2, 3 T3s and a T1, and off we go. It was never as simple as just one casualty. And 9 times out of 10 on the way to the casualty site, things would change again on the radio. So it can be very confusing. We didn't always just pick up British soldiers who'd been injured. We'd go and pick up any Afghan locals. We'd pick up, any other NATO soldiers. And I've been tasked once to go and pick up a Taliban soldier who was involved in troops in contact with their own British troops. So we had our British troops come over the ramp on their stretchers with gunshot wounds, and then had to carry the Taliban over the ramp on a stretcher as well. So morally, that was pretty difficult to kind of swallow that day, I must admit. And I've seen troops take their last breath on the back of my aircraft, but I've also seen troops that have come over the back of the aircraft already dead and have been brought back to life on the back of my aircraft by the medics, the amazing medics that we had in the British Army and Air Force. And I have to say, at one point in Afghanistan, it was the only place in the world where you could survive a non-survivable injury. which says a lot. You know, that's absolute testament to the British forces at the time. And that's kind of what we would see when we got to the landing site. So it was always pretty confusing. We'd land on, we kind of know what to expect from what we got on the 9-liner, put the ramp down, and the force protection guys would run out, surround the aircraft and give us force protection. The combat medic would run out the back and meet the stretcher, do a handover, and then the stretcher would come towards us. So you can see lots of guys, there's 2 stretchers in that picture, they'd come over. We can actually fit up to 7 stretchers on the back of a Chinook on the floor because we could pick up the extra seats and move them out of the way. So they'd come on the ramp, lay the stretchers down and run out the back, and we'd always swap another stretcher out, a folded up stretcher, so they had some stretchers back 1 for 1. But then other people come on that were walking wounded. We had soldiers coming on with bits of kit, with weapons, and the confusion and chaos down the back of the aircraft when you're trying to lift from a merch out was always pretty immense. So the last thing we do is when we get all the force protection collapsed back in was a quick head count to make sure that we had everyone on board and the right people on board, and then we'd get back to Bastion as soon as we could. So first thing we would always do is speak to the medics who were on headset. They'd be plugged in the intercom, and they'd be assessing the injuries and tell us whether or not they wanted us to go high and smooth if it was a head injury, or just fast as we could go straight back to Bastion in a straight line. And sometimes that meant over the green zone, which was the area running right up in the middle of the Helmand Valley along the river, where 9 times out of 10 you're going to get shot at. That's where most of the Taliban hid in amongst the green zone. So, but we do it because we had to get those casualties back to Bastion as soon as we could. And the landing site at Bastion was called HLS Nightingale, which I thought was really apt. But yeah, so we would essentially get those guys back, land at Nightingale, and the fire engines would meet us there, and the firefighters would help offload the casualties. They go into an ambulance and then straight across into the hospital. And it was very rare that we would follow up the injuries. You would know if someone hadn't made it because a thing called op minimize would be called around Camp Bastion, which meant that somebody had obviously paid the ultimate price and had died of their injuries. And op minimize was put in force. Essentially, all the internet and all the phones got switched off. And it was actually a really good system. The reason why that was done is so that nobody could phone home and tell someone who'd been injured or who'd been killed before the parents were informed through the appropriate channels, or that otherwise were informed properly. And you know, a lot of the junior guys I worked with towards the end of the campaign used to get really annoyed. Oh, I can't believe the internet's down. I said, thank your lucky stars that when it gets switched back on, you can phone home and say that you're okay. And they said, well, I wouldn't call home and say who it was anyway. Yeah, but you would call home and say that you're okay. And sometimes that's enough information for someone to realise who's not okay. Is phoning and saying, well, it wasn't our crew. All that means is that it could have been another crew. So the best thing to do, and it used to absolutely break my heart when op minimize was called, and it would be on for days, because you just knew that there was a family waiting at home for that awful message to come through, and it was taking days and days to get hold of them. But with that, absolutely the greatest honour. This picture is Tricky 73 was the call sign for the MERT that we used. So as soon as we belled up on frequency, Tricky 73, the rest of the airwaves shut down and nobody else would talk and just let us get on with it. So that's one of the blast walls, and the blast walls around Camp Bastion were absolute works of art. So you can see somebody a bit too much time holding standby had done Odium High Street up there for us. And then on the left, that's me on my last day in Afghanistan in 2015, and that's me beside the 1310 flight emblem. And 1310 flight was essentially what we all deployed on. The Chinook fleet around the world deployed as 1310 flight. So 18 and 27 squadron, when we were in Afghanistan, were all collectively 1310 flight. So pretty proud of that, really. And sadly, whenever Camp Bastion got handed back to the Afghan locals in 2015, when we pulled out, all of the blast walls got whitewashed, which is so sad because they were absolutely beautiful to look at. And I think a few people have captured them with some pictures, and I'm pretty proud I've got those. So Glorious Stits brings me on to Glorious Stits. So us aircrew love to have a funny name badge, don't we? It's a kind of a known thing around us all. And many moons ago, someone made a bit of a joke and said, oh, Liz, you can be called Glorious Stits. And it stuck. So I spent my entire time in Afghanistan with a black badge with pink writing, although you can't really pick it out in the picture, with Glorious Stits. And she was my alias whenever I was at war. And yeah, she used to increase the troops of the morale of the troops whenever they used to get on and have a little chuckle at Gloria Stitz in the back of my helmet. And yeah, it was always a bit of a laugh and a bit of like hearted humour in amongst some really dark days. And that's me coming in after a long day's tasking, carrying all the kit that we used to carry, and that's during the day, so that's not even with the night vision goggles and the night vision torches and things that we had to use. But Gloria Stitch, she's actually been out to war in terms of on the battlefield, because one day I went out to do my walk around on a MRT standby actually, and she was gone. She was taken off the back of my helmet, and I was gutted. I'd had her for about 6 years. This is my 6th day. I did 10 deployments to Afghanistan in total, but it was about my 6th deployment, and she was gone. I was like, she's been everywhere with me, and was gutted. I thought maybe somebody's come to have a look around the aircraft had taken her for a bit of a giggle. And about 3 days later, we went to collect some troops that we dropped into Helmand for a deliberate op a few days earlier. And this troop came running up the ramp, and he looked at me, stopped dead in his tracks and started patting around on his combats, pulled her out, and there was Gloria Stitz. And he shouted in my ear, "She got stuck on my Birkin as I went out." And my badge had been ripped off, and I hadn't even noticed. I'd been ripped off and was stuck with him for 3 or 4 days out in the battlefield. So she's actually been to war. Pretty proud of that. So Afghanistan was an interesting time. It was very defining years of my career. I joined the Air Force to do a job. I was very privileged to be able to do 2 deployments to Iraq and 10 deployments to Afghanistan, and had a really great career out of it. You know, it's funny when you go to war, you have that sense of purpose, which is what I'd always wanted. And I'd love to say that this slide is the end of the talk, and leave it there, but it's not. So I left the forces in 2019. I was medically discharged out, unfortunately, having, like I mentioned earlier, a really bad neck after wearing helmet and MBGs for essentially over 3,000 hours flying on the back of those wonderful shaking machines. So I was in a pretty bad way. My last deployment, or my last detachment, was down the Falkland Islands, and I essentially came back from the Falkland Islands in 2018, sorry, and just couldn't move my neck. It was like being attached to a crucifix. So I got downgraded. I did lots of rehab courses, got sent to Headley Court, which was the centre of excellence for injuries amongst the forces. And ironically, when I was at Headley Court, it was very quiet. And I remember mentioning to someone how quiet it was, and the mess was very quiet. And they said, in the heyday of Afghanistan, there was a waiting list for rooms here. And that really struck me quite hard. But anyway, I did my course at Headley Court, tried everything. It turns out I damaged two vertebrae in my neck that were irreparably damaged. So I got offered a desk job, and I joined the Air Force to fly. So I tried my desk job for about 3 months, whilst longingly staring out the window, looking at Chinooks taking off and going, wonder where they're going today, and decided that it wasn't for me. So I took the option of being medically discharged and left in 2019 in January, and had a really good year. I was finding my feet as a civilian. I started to work with a wonderful charity who worked down the road in Blackbush called Airability. Some of you may have heard of them. Absolutely amazing charity, and they fly anyone who's got a disability, and they also do scholarships for disabled veterans. So I had absolutely found my purpose again in charge of that, and I was getting money through to help a lot of disabled veterans learn how to fly. Some of the guys are guys that I picked up in Afghanistan off the battlefield, and it had gone full circle. They've been through the system at Headley Court, popped out the other side, and they're now waving off to me as they go flying for the day and getting their pilot's license. So it was brilliant. And I had a really wonderful year working for Airability. And then in 2020, Boris locked us all down. So I now find myself in my little apartment in Basingstoke on my own, with very little purpose in life, as I think a lot of us did during COVID, because we were stuck in 4 walls. I lived in my own, and all the coping mechanisms that I'd always used throughout my entire time in the Air Force for a lot of the trauma that I'd seen, such as, on a bad day on MRT, and my worst day on MRT, we had picked up 14 casualties in one day, which was a lot. It was back to back. It was relentless. But the way I coped with that was things like going to the gym. Spent a lot of time at the gym, did a lot of running, and I found that over my years in the Air Force, I got better and better at running, because I'd run more, decompress what was going on, and seeing friends like we all did. There's nothing like going down the pub with your mates, having a good pint and talking about what you've been up to and what you've been doing and what you think about things. And that was all gone for all of us during lockdown. And as the year went on, I started to slowly become more unraveled. And I knew it was happening, from someone who'd been so sporty before. I'd done a few Ironman triathlons. I used to cycle every day. I'd get I'd wake up on a lockdown day and I'd look at my bike and I'd get all dressed in my lycra, stand and stare at it, and then undress and go back to bed. I just couldn't find the motivation for anything. And I began to suffer from insomnia. I'm from someone who's had a routine their whole life, suddenly just absolutely shot because of lockdown. I was really struggling to sleep. And throughout that time, I started to roll a lot of stuff around in my head, a lot of the stuff that I'd seen in Afghanistan. I remember one night looking up the soldiers that I picked up in Afghanistan and those merch outs I was talking about. We'd never again looked up their back catalogue. And I found myself a book looking up the names of the soldiers who died on my aircraft and looking up their stories to find out, did they have kids, were they married, personalising them and turning them into a human being instead of what essentially was a very precious piece of freight. And I knew I was in trouble, but I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to be a burden. And that's the thing that I'd gone through my entire career. A question I got asked earlier was, were you ever made to feel special or different in any way for being a female doing your job? And I never was. I was always just one of the team, but I never wanted to let the team down. I never wanted to be a burden and just be, being the girl crying at the back of the tent. So I didn't say anything. And then in August 2020, I woke up one day and decided that I was going to end my life. So I woke up that morning and I described the day as being an out-of-body experience. It was essentially like watching my life through a lens for the whole day, or being body snatched by the Grim Reaper. And I made a phone call to the GP straight away that morning and said, I have woken up this morning and I feel suicidal. It's very unlike me. This is not like me at all. Can I come in and speak to someone? Got fobbed off a little bit. Oh, you have to make an appointment on Thursday. I'm thinking that's going to be too late. And eventually the GP called me back in the afternoon and prescribed me some antidepressants and told me to come and get them that afternoon. At no point did he ask any other meds that I was on. It turns out I was taking a drug for my neck injury, which was a pretty nasty drug called amitriptyline, which is also an antidepressant, but it's a nerve blocker, which I've been taking for this pain. And it turns out it can also hijack the mood really badly, which I didn't know. But at no point did the GP ask this. He didn't say, what other medications are you taking, or look at my notes or anything. So he prescribed me some antidepressants and said, come across and get them. So that afternoon I went across, I spent the entire day planning with meticulous detail how I was going to end my life that night, and almost with aircrew precision, how many pills I would need to end it outright, how many pills I would need to be in the 50-50 bracket, and then weighing up how many pills I could get hold of. I went across that afternoon and picked up my prescription that the GP had just prescribed me. I could see the surgery from my house, and at no point did he say, do you want to come in and talk to someone? No, just come across and get your pills. So off I went and picked up the pills he prescribed me and a repeat prescription of this amitriptyline drug, which is a really nasty drug, and went home with 120 pills and tidied the house, had dinner, wrote my suicide note to my parents, and didn't cry once. Absolutely no emotion whatsoever. Spent, I prepped everything so that if anyone was going to find me, that it would all be, the house would be tidy, all that kind of stuff, took out the rubbish, and yeah, no emotion. And it turns out this drug amitriptyline is an emotion blocker. So my body and my mind had essentially checked out of life that day, and I was just going through the motions. So at midnight that night, having had a shower, put on a nice dress, did hair and makeup, I sat on the edge of my bed at midnight and took 95 amitriptyline, and don't remember anything else really from the evening. But the fact I'm stood in front of you tonight telling you I obviously survived. And I woke up 2 days later in Basingstoke intensive care unit with a tube down my throat, incubated, and suddenly really didn't want to die. I remember waking up and opening my eyes and couldn't speak because the tube's down my throat, and trying to pull at the cannulas that were in my arm. That's one picture of one of my arms, the other one looked the same, and I just didn't want to die, which was so far removed from how my mindset had been 2 days previous, which proves that your mind can play immense tricks on you when it wants to. Anyway, it turns out that I wasn't dying. The medics had saved me. So I spent a couple more days in intensive care, and eventually came out of hospital on a Saturday. And then I was reunited with my phone. So I was able to finally put the jigsaw puzzle together of what had happened after I'd taken the overdose. It turns out that I called the Samaritans for 13 seconds at about 20 to 1, quarter to 1. And then I'd called 911, and I was on the phone to them for about 10 minutes, none of which I remember. I still think I might remember someone saying, don't go to sleep. but I don't know if that's my brain filling in the gaps or not. But it turns out that I had calls an ambulance, 911 though, not 999. So I clearly had been watching too much Netflix during lockdown. But yeah, I was a very lucky girl. I lived within sight of the hospital, and I phoned the ambulance crew a few months later to thank them, and they said if I hadn't lived within sight of the hospital, I probably wouldn't have made it. So a very, very lucky girl. But I guess that's kind of where I want to kind of just say about, you know, I talk very openly about my mental health, because after that I came out of hospital and thought, well, I was very euphoric actually. I remember thinking, well, that's it. It doesn't really get much worse than that. You know, you're not going to get any lower than wanting to end your life. And actually it was just the beginning. It was the beginning of a very long battle, putting all the files that I'd thrown out of my head that day onto the floor back in the right place. And I think what was so important was that I didn't just, I went through 2 years essentially of PTSD counselling with the military, well, the veterans. And I feel very lucky that I am a veteran, because I know that the waiting lists in the civilian mental health system are long. I was straight in on the Monday with combat stress and straight in with a counsellor that week. So I was very, very lucky. But part of the process of putting like those files back together and back in your head is reading what's in those files. You know, the most important thing for me was not to scoop them up and put them all back in there and lock them all away again. It was to read every single file and go, that was trauma and that was traumatic and that was sad what you saw that day, and acknowledging that it's okay to feel sad about that. I'd spent 17 years going stiff upper lip, don't feel the burden, you know, you're going to see this stuff every day. And we as troops and we as soldiers, you know, from the very guy in the ditch right up to the top commander, we get trained from day one in the military to go to the fight, to run towards the fight and not to run away. So you're already used to overcoming those emotions in your brain, and essentially you process your brain to block out those emotions, and that's what had happened. So yeah, I spent a very long 2 years back together really, but I probably learned more about myself in those 2 years than I did in the 17 years I was in the Air Force. And during that time, found it quite cathartic to start writing poetry. So I started putting pen to paper, most of which was all about my time in Afghanistan, and did what we always do, is post on Facebook, and it was really well received. So I ended up starting to write a bit of a journal. I wish I'd started this the day I started my RAF career, but I never did, and I didn't really take enough photos during my career either. But I started to go back to like day one of joining the Air Force, and 3 weeks later, I essentially written a book. So I was out walking with a friend one day, and I think we were in lockdown 3 at this point, and I said, oh, don't laugh, I've written a book, I think. And she said, oh, that's amazing, email it over. So I did, and she read it and said, this is amazing, Liz, you should send it to a publisher. So I did, and 3 weeks later, Pen and Sword emailed me back and said, we want to publish your book, which was just amazing, considering I never wrote the book to be public, to be seen by anyone, and I never also wrote it to be published. And now it came out in September. And I've been really lucky. It went to bestseller on the Air Force biographies not too long after that. Even beat the Red Arrows, which is pretty amazing. But there is there's a positive story to come out of something that was so negative, because I wouldn't be stood in front of you tonight if it hadn't been for that day and the subsequent, putting myself back together. I've been very, very lucky. I've had the most privileged career in the world, and if I could have anything in life, I'd have a rewind button and go back to the start and do it all again. And lots of people say, do you have any regrets? And I don't. Even that day, as bad as it was, it's made me who I am today, and it's given me the story that I can tell you guys today to hopefully take away and know that it is okay to not be okay, and certainly don't do what I did and not tell anyone. If you are, I'm certainly not a mental health nurse by any stretch of the imagination, but I've lived and breathed it. I've been in the dark places. So I always like to kind of end with that kind of message, is that we all have those days, and certainly lockdown did none of us any favours. So yeah, just talk to each other, and your best mates are the ones that will pick it up before anyone else. So yeah, so that actually is the end, and hopefully leave with the message of hope, because I stand in front of you tonight in a really good place, having finished all of my